am back with Max today to continue our Belonging and Diversity series. We had a different idea for the second episode in this. However, with all of the talk about gender and trans athletes and things like that, we wanted to take a minute to focus in on that and give an overview of kind of gender in sports in general and how we've come to be where we are.
Yeah, it's kind of a hot topic right now. And I think it's really valuable to zoom out from the really contentious conversations that are being had about trans people in sports and ask some questions about why is this conversation happening in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously what we have today is horseback riding is not divided by gender. We have men and women competing against each other, and that is pretty uncommon in sports as they are.
I think that makes horse sports an interesting case study for discussing gender equality in sports and discussing power dynamics, because the way that it operates is a lot different from other organized sports. And I wanted to start off with just some numbers and statistics about trans people to give us a backdrop for this conversation. And so 0.5%, so that's 0.5% of adults in the United States identify as trans. 1.4% of teenagers, so people from the age of 13 to 17 in the United States, identify as trans. Not all of those people identify as trans women, who are the people who are kind of being discussed in the sports world. And even less of those people do sports at all. So the number that I've seen thrown around by experts is that there are more than likely less than 100 people total in the United States who participate in public sport, public school sports. So that is across the entire United States, every grade, every school, every state, cumulatively, less than 100 people that we're talking about participating in sports. So when I hear that, my brain goes to, why are we having this conversation? And why is this narrative being pushed by kind of the conservative right? And what's going on behind the scenes? They say when their left hand is doing something, what's the right hand doing? What's going on here is my question.
Yeah, 100%. And I think to answer that question, we have to consider women's roles in sports cumulatively. And we will talk about horses specifically as well. But women also were not always welcome in equestrian sports. They were not able to participate in the Olympics until almost 55 years after women were in the Olympics at all.
Yeah, I think people have a really idealized view of gender in horse sports, because the way that it is now makes it really feel very equal. But it was actually a pretty hard-fought battle to get here, and I don't think that that's really acknowledged by a lot of people. And I think we have to kind of roll all the way back to the Victorian era first to start this conversation and talk about how kind of in that period of time was when we saw some of the first big shifts towards viewing women as delicate and fragile, especially when kind of considered in the context of childbearing and kind of managing a family. Back then, we saw a lot of restrictions on women that were purportedly to protect them. And when I say that, I would like us all to think about, why are we seeing these trans athlete bans being pushed, right? It's literally called the Protect Women Act. So there's a thread there that we can follow through history to see, why are we here?
Right. And I mean, we know that the thoughts from the Victorian era were not correct. They were claiming to be, quote, protecting women and also diagnosing them with a wandering womb. We know that your womb doesn't move around your body. That's not how that works. And all of these things were in place to minimize their importance and to keep them confined to a household. And we saw the most major shift during World War II, culturally, for women, because that is when there were so many men taken out of households, taken out of the workforce, taken out of organized sports. I mean, the Major League Baseball was put on pause because there were not enough men to play the sports. And women instead were entering the workforce. They were leaving their households. They were starting some of their own clubs and getting involved in their own sports. And they discovered that they were not, in fact, getting hurt and dying on the streets because their bones were too fragile, but they were having fun and getting to engage in a space that was previously inaccessible, which is where the fight for sports equality started.
And that timeline lines up with the history of women in equestrian sports as well. And I did a little bit of research and found some information that the FEI kind of posted online around like a few years ago around kind of celebrating women's history in equestrian sports. And that article also talked about how during and like post World War II, people got used to seeing women on horses in general because women had to take over kind of the household duties. And at that time, horses were still integral to kind of the middle class family life, such that it was. And that combined with the push for more women's rights in general led to that trend also showing up in the horse world. And like you mentioned, women began to be officially allowed to compete in the Olympics in the year 1900. Women were not allowed to compete in any equestrian sports until 1952. And a part of that is because it wasn't until 1952 that the Olympics allowed people to compete in equestrian sports if they weren't military officers. So that is kind of when horse sports were officially demilitarized, was in 1952, and women were allowed to compete. But they were only allowed to compete in dressage, because the other jumping or eventing related disciplines were viewed as far too dangerous.
Protecting women, again.
Right. So we see this thread carrying through history and imposing restrictions on people based on arbitrary conditions of power, essentially. And I will just say, as a point of pride, in 1952, there were 4 women who competed in the Olympics that year in dressage, and one woman whose name was Liz Hartel, who was from Denmark, won the individual silver in dressage, and she did that while she was paralyzed from the knee down from polio. And after that accomplishment, there was very little room for anybody to say that women weren't like qualified or capable or competent, but there was still conversation around dressage being the only safe sport for women to compete in. So then we saw in 1964, the first woman competed in eventing, and her name was Lana DuPont, and she was from America. She was a USA competitor.
That was the international stage. We've got this culture shift happening at the same time that there is a culture shift happening in the United States, just to kind of zoom back into where we are and where most of the listening audience is. And like I mentioned a little earlier, we had these women who were gaining confidence and who were gaining a desire to be involved and seeing that there were options that they could fight for. And that is when movement that turned into the legislation that is known as Title IX today really started, was with women joining intercollegiate sports and with women joining these intramurals and things like that. And when that was happening, men's sports, or sports just in general, were feeling threatened by the presence of women, because this has been a male-dominated area. The people in charge were men, and women posed a threat to that. So when Title IX was passed, the NCAA pushed back on it really hard because they saw it as a threat to their power and their influence, which, like, power is also a central theme here. We've talked about protecting women, and the people who have been saying we need to protect women are the people in power. And they have always been the people in power because in order to maintain their power, they need a group to infantilize and they need a group to target. And women are routinely the ones who are being infantilized.
And I think if we look back at that history of men in power needing a group to kind of subjugate in order to maintain their power, and that group traditionally, historically being women, we can also look at why are conservatives picking on trans people? Like, why is it trans people? Why is this happening, even though there are so few trans people competing in sports? And I think what you just said, right? Trans people are smaller in number, smaller in power. Transgender journeys and medical transition are not well understood by a majority of kind of laymen Americans, because it's a very personal thing, and it's a very, like, medical transition is so dependent on the person, and it's so different depending on who you are and your body and what you want and what brings you euphoria. But it's a really easy group of people to pick on. And when people in power want to maintain or expand their power, they pick the weakest person to pick on. And that's what's happening. So I think it's really important that we all zoom out. And especially if you are a woman who participates in equine sports and you find it particularly empowering that men and women compete on equal footing, and you enjoy the ability as a woman to be seen as an equal in that arena, I think it's really important that you recognize that your equality is built on the backs of women who did not have that, and that your access is as interrelated to a trans person's access to sports as anything else, even if you don't think about it that way, because all of our liberation is linked. Trans rights are women's rights, and that's just the way that it is.
Yep. As soon as you start taking liberties away from one group, it becomes a lot easier to take liberties away from other groups. And if you don't think that women are one of the groups that will be targeted and have their liberties taken away, you're foolish. Like, I'm sorry to say it that way, but that's a really naive way of approaching the world. And I also just want to qualify just like a little note that you said earlier when you were talking about like they pick on the weakest. Like, that is not to say that trans people are weak in any way, shape, or form.
As a trans person, I don't consider myself fairly weak, but I also consider myself not well protected under the law or in our society.
Well, exactly. And when you are in that much of a minority, legislators don't have to worry about the way that you're voting, because you are not going to win or lose them in election with your vote.
Right. We are not a powerful voting bloc.
Right.
And so we are not represented by our legislators.
Right.
And that's the way that it is.
Right. You don't have the same level of voice or of power.
No, I think that there's a status quo of power. And trans people are at the bottom, near the bottom in some ways. So,
which we'll get into more when we talk about intersectionality too, because there's all sorts of things that go into power dynamics. But refocusing back onto sports and thinking about how we have kind of tried to mitigate Title IX. Well, I haven't personally, but the NCAA tried to mitigate Title IX and tried to push it down. It led to this kind of compromise of women and men's sports being divided. So it was like, yeah, we're both, everybody has access to the same sports. You can all participate in sports, but we're going to keep them separate, which again was said to be to protect women and like maintain the integrity of sports. But let's be real, men don't like to share. So we had this narrative of these sports are separate to protect women, but it was really to protect male egos, because it's never actually about protecting women.
No, and I think something to recognize is that taking rights away from trans people under the guise of, quote, protecting women is an incredibly slippery slope and cracks the door wide open to taking away women's rights. And in Trump's executive order that is theoretically to, quote, protect women, there's this paragraph that I'm going to read, and it says, I am also delivering on my promise to secure our borders, deport illegal criminal aliens, rebuild our economy, improve school choice, make America healthy again, and improve access to in vitro fertilization. And I have only just started. And I want to point out that there is not one single mention in there of women's bodily autonomy, women's voting rights, women's rights to no-fault divorce, right? There's a bunch of things in there that are just not mentioned at all. And so if we're trying to protect women, what are we protecting them from? That's my question. And I think the answer is we're protecting them from them being able to make their own choices and subvert the power structure of the United States.
Yep. Yeah, because eventually it becomes we have to protect them from themselves and from the silly choices that the ladies might make. And we've seen that before. People have done that. That's why women weren't able to vote.
Right, and that's where we see this like circular return to the Victorian era where women aren't allowed to participate in sports because they're too fragile. And we also are seeing in the US this rise of rhetoric about women need to have more children, which was a huge factor in why in the Victorian era women were so heavily safeguarded, was like under this guise of bearing children and under the guise of like needing to protect their wombs, essentially, because in that power structure, women are seen as a means to increase the population. They're not seen as people. They're not seen as full citizens. They're not seen as anything other than their uterus, essentially.
Yep. Because men are terrified that if women have an option other than make babies, stay home, take care of house, they will not make babies, stay home, take care of house, which is silly. It's like, it's a similar argument that comes up when we talk about livable wages and pay equality, like in general, and how, you know, some, like one thought piece that people like to pull is, well, if everybody got paid the same, or if nobody had to worry about working, then nobody would work. And that's just not true. Enabling people to choose a career that's fulfilling to them and enabling women to make their own choices is not going to destroy the economy. People will still become doctors, and women will still choose to have babies. Like, there are women in my life I know who want to have children, but this sort of rhetoric and this sort of slippery slope towards taking away rights and autonomy makes that really scary to think about too. Like, it is doing the opposite of their intention, because believe it or not, when you infantilize people and when you attack their civil liberties, they don't feel terribly safe and protected, and the desire to bring more life into the world.
Right. And I think, like, especially in conversations around women's health, we're seeing a pretty steady decline in women's ability to safely have children because of how policed their health is being. And I also think this ties into the gender equality and the gender gap in horse sports in general, which I think is really interesting. And I'll preface this by saying that I think any woman who decides to have a child and spend time at home with their child is like an honorable, beautiful thing to do. And I wish that in our country we had better financial support for that to be an option. That's a piece of this too, right? Like, people can't afford childcare right now.
Yep.
And nothing is being done about that. And how is that protecting women if we're not allowing them care for their children? But I will say that even though equine sports are have gender equality in how the competitions are set up, I think it's fair to say that most of us see at the higher levels a larger percentage of male competitors over female competitors. And in the areas that I have participated in horses, it's odd because you see more women at the lower levels, which has always been a question of, like, I wonder why that is. I wonder why we see more men at the higher levels. And my personal theory is that we have such a culture in the US of expecting women to give up their careers in order to raise children and have families, in part because we don't have accessible childcare and accessible work-life balance, that women who are incredibly driven to succeed in equine sports kind of have to make a choice between having a family and having success. And more often than not, they may decide to have a family because that's how our society is set up.
Yep, that is all of the messaging that they're getting for their entire life, is that if you choose your hobby and your passion, you're selfish.
Right. And I think there are many women who balance it all, right? Who are like absolute superstars.
And they're queens.
And they're queens. And they say, you know what? F that. I want to have a family and do this thing that I absolutely love for the rest of my life. But that's terrifying and really hard. And it usually means making sacrifices. And it usually means making sacrifices in a world where prioritizing yourself is demonized, especially if you're a woman. Because when you're a woman, you're not seen as somebody who is allowed to prioritize yourself.
Or, and this is the exception to that being, unless you have money. Because as with most things, money equals more privilege. So if you are a woman who is riding and you have money, you can in fact have it all. But if you do not have that privilege, then if you are a woman and you choose yourself, you are seen as deviant. And that brings us back to trans people, because the queer community in general, and trans people specifically, are always seen as deviant.
They are. And in kind of the study of deviance, there are a lot of theories that discuss the idea that, like, the dominant power group in any sociocultural situation will label lower groups as deviant as a way to maintain and expand their power and control, which is what we're seeing and what we have seen in the past for women in the US. And trans people and queer people and people of color and other minorities are kind of added into that as well. And right now we're seeing trans people really being used as a weapon to increase power for the people in control.
Yeah, and there's a lot of misinformation that is being used and a large lack of information, which is not a new tactic. Like, these studies are being specifically not funded, like they're just not able to start when they are proposed in order to continue a lack of information, because the less you know about something, the easier it is to control the narrative. We saw this with women's health. That was a whole movement, is that medicine has historically been learned about on male bodies, which is why women have a harder time getting their needs met when they go to the doctor, because our understanding of medicine is off of a male body, not a female body.
Right. And right now we're watching the current administration shut down health websites on the government websites, health pages that have to do with women's health. We're watching the government disband and defund research groups that are designed to evaluate the impact of abortion policies in certain states, which were starting to show really, really severely negative outcomes for even women who really wanted to have babies. And those are being shut down because that is not the information that this administration wants out in the world. And we're also seeing that with this entire deletion of any kind of gender ideology from the federal government. Like, this is a targeted attempt to remove rights from people who this administration views as threats to their power.
And like you had mentioned earlier, people in power need a group to target. And because over the last couple of decades, trans rights have increased and trans visibility has increased, and there has been an increase in overall safety, that means that this very small population has had a lot of attention on it that previously was largely positive, and that is now being subverted into an attack in order to, again, maintain power and propel power. So when we're hearing about these things, think about it. Try to understand and unpack, what are you being told and why are you being fed this narrative?
And I see a lot on social media. I see in these conversations around this issue of trans athletes, you see the whole spectrum of responses, right? You see people who are super supportive of like bans for trans athletes and who kind of buy into this narrative of demonizing trans people. You see on the other end, you see people who are like, this is ridiculous, like opposing these bans. But there's also this like really large middle group of people who I see who kind of make the joke of like, oh, haha, like this isn't important at all. Who are like, kind of make those posts where it's like, oh, I'm so glad we're worrying about such a small percent of the population when we could be worrying about bigger problems. So they're kind of neutral in that sense, but they're acknowledging that is being blown out of proportion by this administration. But I don't often see those people expand that into a question of why. Why is this being blown out of proportion? And that brings us to this idea that has been proven by a lot of research in kind of the sociological sphere of this us versus them mentality. And neurobiologically, it has been shown that when humans are divided into an us versus them situation, when you're given an in-group and an out-group, which actually there's a specific study that I think is hilarious because they proved that this like in-group, out-group brain thinking can be as arbitrary as people who are wearing a hat and people who aren't. So our brains are designed to do this because evolutionarily it was beneficial for social cohesion for us to identify with our in-group and dislike our out-group. And so we're actually having, in my opinion, having that like biological process that is built into our brains weaponized against us. Because when you're in that kind of situation where you are like, this is the group I'm part of and that group is not my group and I do not like them. When you are in that space, your brain loses some of its cognitive processing abilities and you lose some of your ability to critically think through the disinformation that you're seeing online.
It is absolutely intentional, and we have known this forever. I mean, united we stand, divided we fall. That is a quote, everybody knows that. And when we talk about, I mean, for you and I, this is probably the most impactful, the LGBT community. They've tried to divide us so many different ways. And the one that I have seen most recently is LGB without the T. That's nothing. I'm sorry, but like, if you are one of those people, learn your history. We owe all of our rights to trans women of color. and we always will, and your ignorance is not going to change that. And it is just such a clear example of how this divide is created. And then on the larger scale, we have this divide that's trying to be created between cis women and trans women. When you have way more, if you are a cis woman, you have way more in common with a trans woman than you do with any of the politicians who are making these decisions.
And I'm going to spin off into a tangent here and just go ahead and say that, like, the only war that matters is class war, right? Like, this, the reason why this is happening, in my opinion, is that if people in power, like people who have the money, and this, like, we are turning into an oligarchic country, so I think we can say that
we're there.
I think we can say that, like, currently the people in power are the people who have the most wealth, right? And collectively, the population of the United States, if we were to all cooperate and acknowledge the fact that what actually matters is the wealth gap, we could probably solve that problem. However, we are being put into these us versus them situations where we can't, because our brains are in that space, it's incredibly difficult to think yourself through, like, why is this happening? What would actually fix the problems that I am experiencing on a day-to-day basis as far as the wealth inequality in this country? And how does that have literally nothing to do with trans people?
Right. Well, and we're talking about us versus them and it being evolutionarily beneficial. There is a real us versus them, and it is the class war. It is us versus the top 1%. That is actually what is important, and that is why they have spent so much money on all of this propaganda to convince us that we have more in common with them than we actually do. Because you are far more likely to end up as the unhoused person who you pass on your way to work than you are to be the next Elon Musk. And if you think differently, I don't know what to tell you, because that's foolish. You are not going to be a billionaire.
No, none of us are. That's I think it's incredibly important to just circle back to the idea that all of our liberation is connected. Trans rights, our women's rights, are all of the other rights that need to happen in this world. And losing that thread is where they win.
Right. They rely on the populace not using their critical thinking. And they rely on a populace that is able to be manipulated with propaganda. And as I'm sure if you are online at all, you have heard, you are not immune to propaganda.
No, like, and that's the point of this neurobiological basis for, like, group think and, like, group sorting. Like, none of us are immune to what is being levied against us right now. It's a very smart, very targeted, very efficient use of processes in our brains that have been proven to be there. And the only thing that we can do to, like, step away from that is to ask the kinds of questions of who is benefiting from this, who is suffering from this, why is this actually happening, and what do I do about it, and how does it affect me, even in ways that I wouldn't necessarily at first glance notice.
And just to head this off, because I can already see the comments asking why a horse podcast is talking about this and is taking the time to talk about this. And it is because no matter what hobby you engage in, no matter who you are, no matter where you are, this is an important conversation. And you must critically examine your own life. You must examine your own privilege. And you must ask yourself what you can do about it. Because the only way we move forward is when we work together and we collectively stand up for those groups that are being targeted. Because that tells the people in power that they can't get away with it.
And I also think, in terms of bringing this home to people who ride horses, who are kind of like, I don't know what this episode has to do with me. If you circle back to this, like, wealth inequality idea and this wealth gap, that is something that we see seriously affecting people's ability to access equine sports. Like, we see that affecting the loss of land throughout the United States and the ability for events to host in New England, where we are, we're seeing massive event after massive event drop off the calendar in the kind of like Area 1 eventing because people can't afford to maintain their land and they're having to shut down. And like we're seeing barns struggle to stay open. And so I think critically examining this like underlying wealth power divide leads us to this conversation around who has power, who do they not want to have power, and how does that affect all of our daily lives.
Yeah. And if you've made it to the end of this episode and you're not somebody who normally thinks this way, you get a gold star.
Yeah.
If this is your first time engaging with a quote liberal conversation, congratulations. I'm very proud of you. If this is a conversation that you're used to having, also still good job. I know we both got up on our soapboxes a little bit, but I genuinely appreciate everybody who has listened through to the end of this episode.
Yeah, I do too. And I also appreciate anybody who hears this and has to really sit with it before they decide how they feel about it. Because I think it's really important that we also slow down our processing in this kind of like age of disinformation. And I think it's really important to like hear things that feel uncomfortable and sit with it and ask yourself why that's uncomfortable, which is also going to come back up in our intersectionality episode where we talk about what is privilege? What are you feeling when you're uncomfortable when you hear about other people's struggles?
But this is all to say, stand up for your trans brothers and sisters. You have more in common with them than you don't. And as always, thank you for listening and for hanging out with us for a little bit. And we'll talk to you next time. Thank you for joining us this week at the Horse Girl Gazetteer. You can find us online at Horse Girl Gazetteer on Facebook or Instagram and Horse Girl Gazette on TikTok and Patreon. You can also email us questions or comments at horsegirlgazetteer@gmail.com. If you find yourself enjoying our content, please leave us a review and share the link with your friends to help others find their way here. Any and all support is greatly appreciated. Talk to you later.